Hi guys, so I wanted to make a video on how I go about selecting scales and modes to use in my improvisation. Of all the different scales, why do I choose to use the ones I do? But first, let's briefly cover a few different approaches or ways of thinking about improvisation and when you'd use them. So jazz musicians generally talk about two different approaches to improvisation. The horizontal approach, where you think in terms of scales, and the vertical approach, where you think in terms of chords. And when improvising horizontally, you can either think in terms of a key or a common scale, where you allocate one scale to multiple chords, or in terms of modes, where you allocate one scale per chord. Now, if you have a song that uses lots of chords from different keys, and each chord only lasts a short period of time, say half a bar, then I would generally approach the improvisation vertically by mostly just arpeggiating each chord and then adding in a few passing notes in between your arpeggios, or by using a common scale that fits over all or most of the chords. Now, I've got a video on chord mapping where I discuss how to find and apply these common scales in just such a situation, which I'll link in the description. Now, this is generally because practically it's quite hard to remember and play a separate mode for each chord if the chords are changing every half bar. Right? You don't really have the mental capacity or the time to execute and play a new mode every 2 beats. But if you have a song that doesn't use too many chords and the chords last a relatively long time, say 1 to 2 bars each, then I would generally use the key or common scale approach, where again you allocate a single scale to multiple chords, or the mode approach, where you allocate one scale per chord. Again, simply because you have fewer modes to remember and more time to play each mode. So now let's demonstrate this with an example. Now, I recently published a video of me playing the jazz standard Song for My Father, which again I will also link in the description. Now, this is a good example of a song where you can use the mode approach because the entire song only has 4 chords, and each chord generally lasts about 2 bars. So you have enough time to think and play different scales for each chord. So this song is a bossa nova, and I'll just play the first section A for you so you get a feel for the song. Right, so that's its general vibe. Great, so now which modes do we actually choose? Well, here's a list of modes and scales you can use over each chord type. As a generalization, we want to make sure that the root, third, fifth, and seventh of each chord are in the scale so that the scale fits over that particular chord. So in principle, you could pick any of these modes for each chord type. But in practice, I have 2 main considerations. 1, I want to minimize the number of avoid notes in the scale. And 2, I want to introduce a small change each time I play a new mode. So when I move from one mode to the next, I only want 1 or 2 notes to change. Now, I've got a few other videos where I talk about avoid notes, which I'll also link in the description, but essentially these are notes in a scale that sound dissonant against a particular chord. And this is because they form a dissonant interval with one of the chord tones. Now, generally this means that there is a scale note that is 1 semitone above a chord tone. So for example, we could use the F Phrygian mode over the F minor 7 chord, but that has a flat 2 and a flat 6, which are both a semitone above the root and the fifth of the chord respectively. So the root and the fifth of the chord are F and C, and the scale has a G flat and a D flat in it, which are going to sound really, really dissonant because they're going to clash with those 2 notes in the chords, thus they are avoid notes. and because these notes sound unpleasant, they are generally avoided. Whereas the F Dorian mode does not have any avoid notes over an F minor 7 chord. So you'll find that most musicians use the Dorian mode over minor 7 chords rather than, say, the Phrygian. So you could do this kind of mapping for all the modes as they relate to each chord type and figure out which ones have fewer avoid notes. So in this way, we have a preference for scales that minimize the number of avoid notes against a particular chord. But the second consideration is that you want a couple of notes to change as you move from one mode to the next. So for example, in Song for My Father, it starts on an F minor 7 chord and then goes to an E flat 7 chord. Now when improvising, I could use F Aeolian going to E flat Mixolydian. But these are actually both the same scale, A flat major. So nothing changes when you move from one chord to the next, which to me kind of defeats the purpose of thinking in modes. You may as well just think in terms of keys and use the A flat major scale to improvise over the entire chord progression and not overcomplicate matters by thinking in terms of modes. Alternately, I could use F Dorian followed by E flat whole tone. But now we are changing almost half the notes in the scale and in fact dropping one note altogether. So it's going to sound like quite a big change and thus quite disjointed. Now sometimes you might want that kind of disjointed and disconnected sound, but as a general rule, we generally don't want such a dramatic change. The transition between one mode to the next sounds much smoother if only one or two notes change between them. So in my rendition of Song for My Father, I used F Dorian over F minor 7, E flat Mixolydian over E flat 7, D flat Lydian dominant over D flat 7, and then C Mixolydian flat 6 over C7. Now from the F to the E flat, only one note changes. From the E flat to the D flat, only one note changes. Then from the D flat to the C, 3 notes change. And so I kind of did that on purpose. My first two transitions from the F to the E flat and E flat to the D flat were quite smooth, only one note changing. And then I had almost like a 180 turn and had quite a dramatic change by introducing that C Mixolydian flat 6 mode, which changes 3 notes and therefore sounds quite a bit different and removed from the rest of the improvisation. But that's because I'm on the final 5 chord, which then resolves back to the 1. So I'm kind of emphasizing or building up to the tension. That's my peak tension, the most tension that I develop in my improvisation before then resolving back into that 1 chord. Right, but if I wanted a less dramatic change from that D flat to the C, I could move to C Phrygian dominant, where only 2 notes change rather than 3. So that's the mode approach to improvisation. The other approach I use is thinking in terms of keys or common scales. Now here you need to find one scale that more or less fits all the chords, which again just means that we want the scale to contain most of the chord tones from all the chords. So the ones I used were F blues, which fit okay. And F harmonic minor, which also fit relatively well. And I could have also used F Aeolian. But I didn't use that one because it's a little bit too predictable. You know, the song is in the key of F minor and I just used the F natural minor scale over it. You know, that's a little bit boring, a little bit unimaginative, and possibly a little bit too consonant for me. I like a little bit of dissonance and crunchiness in my solos, which is why I picked scales that fit relatively well, but still have a few of those avoid notes or a few notes missing, a few notes that don't quite fit over this particular chord progression. And that's it. So that was a little bit of a marathon, I admit, so well done if you've made it to the end. But now you know my thought process or my system of selecting scales and modes to use in my improvisation. So hopefully you found that interesting and useful and maybe a little bit enlightening. And otherwise, yes, thank you for watching and I will see you next time.